Hello, everyone, and we'll start with a quick introduction. So my name is Sergei Sergeev. I've been working with SharePoint and Microsoft 365 for many years, mostly as developer because I love development. And also I'm open source contributor. I contribute to my own projects on GitHub and also on community driven projects. Andrew?
Thank you, Sergey. Just a few words of myself. I do SharePoint as well. So for a pretty long time, I would say like 10 years, or who counts, Hey PNP community. Some of you might know me as a guy answering questions about PNP.js, and who doesn't use PNP yet, stop doing it now and go and add it as a dependency on the next project. I also do some stuff not necessarily related to JS, example for Golang, but mostly always connected to SharePoint. And today, which is obvious from the title on this slide, we're covering a concept of styling components within a JS, and to be even more precise, in SharePoint Framework. So let's get started with what's it all about, CSS in JS. And what the heck, Sergey? Tell us more, please.
Yeah, in just a few words, we can say that CSS in JS, that's just a set of ideas or rules or libraries which allow you to write your CSS styles using JavaScript or TypeScript language.
Cool. I would spotlight that CSS in JS is yet another option. So we're not going saying that you should rush and replace the usual CSS routines, but just to consider it as a possibility of applying some CSS in JS when it's beneficial for your case. And next, let's take a look why it's even getting popular in the community.
Yeah, that's true that CSS in JS, that's not a silver bullet, and that's just a modern alternative to known proven things. But historically, when we talk about just pure CSS, then CSS has some problems, maybe some difficulties. So you can see some of them on the screen. So you don't have, for example, dynamic runtime functionality. You do not have modular architecture. Probably you know about this specificity battles, etc. And that is why you can handle all these situations using CSS, JS approach, and even more.
And what if many of these issues are also solved in CSS tools? But to be honest, I'm not so good with CSS to judge this. And maybe some of the attendees as well. So it's even more interesting to get know more. So let's check it out. What are the benefits and drawbacks? What are them?
Yeah, first thing is that you're absolutely right that you can solve all these things using for example, CSS modules or CSS and CSS language extensions like less or SSS. You can use naming conventions. Basically, that's something which is available by default in SharePoint Framework. But additionally, you can use CSS in JS as well. Yeah, and when it comes to pros of this new modern approach, then with CSS in JS, you receive automatic local scoping, also code intelligence and suggestions. You do not have these problems with specificity. Additionally, that's I think it's quite powerful feature. You can use all language possibilities of JavaScript or TypeScript to use state-based, for example, styling or just some kind of dynamic styling. You can apply refactoring a bit easier. You don't need additional compilers. Also, this approach is really good for component-based frameworks like React, and that's and this idea was created probably because of React. And finally, you have better reusability for your styles.
In my experience, I mostly have no issues with CSS, which would be crashed by all of these pros. However, some of them are really neat to my heart. Maybe on the first position, I would place the possibility of using all the features from JavaScript and apply them to CSS. At the same time, isolating all the domain entity components within a reusable module. And also, which is really important, personally, I feel myself much more productive when applying CSS and JS style of coding. But I guess everything has a price. So what should we beware of?
Yeah, sure. There are some trade-offs, and the first and maybe the most common and the most popular drawback is runtime cost. Simply because the CSS in JS pattern or CSS in JS approach or CSS in JS libraries, they use a bit different way of applying styles to a page. Usually they simply inject some required styles in runtime, and also they use special hash calculation functions which calculate some kind of hash based on your CSS style properties. That is why sometimes, for example, if you have a lot of components on your page, hundreds, maybe thousands of components, if you display a list of something, then you might have experience issues if you use CSS in JS wrongly. That is why you should pay special attention at this point. Also, you cannot dive into CSS and JS libraries without some knowledge. So you should learn how it works, how to do things, etc. You cannot migrate from one CSS and JS library to another because there is no such things as interoperability. And also, additional problem is that everybody knows CSS, but only some people knows some CSS and JS libraries. That is why every time you introduce CSS and JS in your code, then you add some additional layer of complexity.
In my experience, I faced little or no runtime cost ever. However, I apply the concept in moderation, but definitely agree that new toys bring something new to learn. And it's really a true story. When I show CSS and JS to my colleagues, some of them scratch their heads and struggle a bit before even accepting the concept. But so far we talk about the concept itself, but not specific tools. Why not to fix it?
Yes, when it comes to libraries, then we can divide all libraries into two big categories. The first one is framework agnostic, and the second one is framework dependent. So we see that when we talk about framework agnostic, then we have emotion, type style, ARVO, and some others. And for framework dependent, we also have emotion because, for example, this library can be used in two modes at the same time. So yeah, these are the most, I would say, the most popular libraries.
And these and others, there's actually so many tools out there. I counted at least 19 in awesome CSS and JS list on GitHub. And that's a little bit distracting. And should I really use some of them? Some of us probably ask, and these to choose.
That's a really good question. Whether you should use it, whether you should use CSS in JS in your next project in general. That's not a simple question. And as you know, and probably as everybody knows, all difficult questions have very simple answer. It depends. Because if you don't have previous experience with CSS and JS, then my recommendation would be read more about this new pattern, especially about pros and cons. Then think about if you're happy with your current way of styling components in your code, or if you're just looking for a new ways to style the components. Then you can try to apply this CSS and JS pattern to one of your small, maybe medium-sized project and see how it works, if it works for you, if you like it or not. Are there any problems? Are there any benefits, etc.? So that's the answer.
Try.
Yeah.
Yeah, old-fashioned try. And to make it simpler to try one of the CSS and JS libraries together with SPFX, today we choose two different libraries with different approaches of solving the problem. So let's take a look and dive into the code and demos. Your turn, Sergei.
Yeah, I will start with TypeStyle. TypeStyle, that's a framework agnostic library, if you remember from the slide, and that's the homepage of the TypeStyle, and the API is quite simple, and that's the reason why I like this library. Basically, this style function, that's a core function core import from TypeStyle, and in this function you pass an object which describes your styles, and basically this object contains CSS properties, and the return value of this function just a unique string, and you can later on you apply this unique string to your, for example, React based component like this. I think that this code is very well familiar for you. Additionally, this TypeStyle library has a helper method called StyleSheet. For example, if you want to style the whole component and if you have a few different elements inside your component, then you can simply use StyleSheet function, which accepts an object with keys, and every key, that's just, as a result, it will be a unique class name. So you call this function like this, where you describe all your elements of your component. And then in your React component, in the same way, and a very similar way to our SharePoint framework, you simply apply these unique classes to corresponding markup. So yeah, this is the demo. So my demo only is slightly simpler than profile sync because I have only one button and you can click, it changes the state. You also can edit section and you can select different styles for section, and you see that the button changes its styles accordingly. So it reacts to different, or it reacts to theme change event. Now let's go and see how it works from code perspective. So let's start with package.json. So first of all, you should install the dependency. Then let's go and see what is here. Here I have my web part component, and what is the most important thing is that I use theme and I use React built-in context provider in order to push my theme value from my top level web part to all child components, so that on every level in hierarchy I can get my theme value and style my components according to themes from SharePoint. So that's a little trick which gives me this opportunity. Also, I have a code which subscribes to theme change event. So this is the way how I'm able to react to these changes. So every time a user changes a theme, then I call this render method again, and everything is get rendered according to a new theme. And then I have this TypeStyle button component. So if I open this folder, then there are two files. The first one is React component itself, and the second one is styles for this component. So here I have a style sheet function that we saw before, and then I have just two keys. That's a root element, and then my button element, and all the CSS styles required for my button. And finally, if you go here, then I use this just custom React hook, which returns back styles object with all the properties I defined in my styles.ts file. So in a way which is very similar to SPFX, I simply apply different unique class names to my elements. So if I go here and if I add something different like this, then I can go ahead and simply change the class name here. So you know how it works. And if we open the hook itself, use themed styles, then the hook simply listens to theme changes, and every time you have a different theme, then it applies different styles using create style function. So here, this create styles function, it accepts SharePoint theme, and this is the reason why I can use different colors. And this is the reason why when I change my section background colors, then my background color for button, for example, it also changes from blue to yellow. Yeah, so this is it from my side. Your turn, Andrew.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen. I'm going to expose a bit of specific of using styled components. That's a pretty popular library out there. It's made specifically for React. Yet React is the thing I use day to day, so it's not a problem for me. Style components have nice site, neat documentation, and great GitHub story. The syntax might be felt sort of funny. However, it's actually an absolutely valid JavaScript. What we can see here is actually called text template literal, and that guy is nothing else but a function. When you import styled, you can define which DOM element type to use, for example, anchor tag, div, span, whatever. And then provide styles this way. In most cases, that styles can be copied from or to SAS models, and the syntax is mostly the same. At least for me, who barely use 30% of SAS features at all. Not only plain CSS can be here, but also some dynamic part provided via JS callbacks. And the component actually ends up as a usual React component, can be exported, reused, composed, and configured with the properties. To use this in SPFX solution, almost none of the opinionated specifics should be cared about. Learning curve for a React developer is actually really tiny, and driven by use case, most can be easily resolved using style component documentation. However, some flavors of SPFX can be added to make solution, for example, theme aware. And my example shows the usage of style component in SPFX, and it's really close, or in some parts even identical to the previous demo held by Sergei. And in my example, I also receive a theme provider using a theme variant using theme provider and try get theme method also subscribe for theme change event and pass it down to the styled components. However, in my sample, it's much the usage is much simpler due to the fact that I am meeting some extra complexity like app context, which is really great in the real life applications. But the idea is to show how to use a specific library within SharePoint Framework. Let's dive to the code. So this part is identical to previously shown. And what it does, it receives the theme and bypass it down to the properties. The style component is represented by this module. Actually receives properties from theme. We can define CSS as in the same manner as if it were SAS module, for example, and we can also bypass these properties. So the properties passed to this component ends up being available in these JS callbacks, and we can receive them using standard JavaScript manner, provide alternative values, and so on and so on. And this component is a reusable unit which can be imported somewhere in the application and used as a wrapper around other parts of the application. Not necessarily should be one single component for all styles, but what's important is that this class, for example, is defined here, so we bypass all the properties from here. And the downside of styled components, which is not actually a huge downside, but the nuance to know is that if you don't install the Visual Studio plugin for dealing with styled components, this part will be just a plain text without any IntelliSense, without helpers about methods, without all this stuff and helpers from the Visual Studio Code and plugin in particular. So to have the best experience with styled component, you got to recall to install Visual Studio Code Style Components plugin, and then all that features are activated. And let's switch to the SharePoint page. Here we are. And this is our humble web part. And let's go to settings, change and look, change the look themes, and select a couple of different themes just to show how it reacts. So the web part using web synced provider receives a new theme and reflects it in the UI automatically and instantly. That's all. So simple. Try to remove all the complexity from the sample. The sample is available on GitHub, will be probably uploaded to samples and be provided somewhere in the link. And finally, no SAS modules suffer during the experiment, demo, and so on.
The whole point, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, show an alternative library to handle the styling, like what Sergei did.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. And even more, all the concept of how the library is used in SharePoint Framework are almost identical. So the difference is a little bit. So only the specifics how the library is used. So any documentation for CSS and JS, in my case, style component, would work for a developer dealing with SharePoint Framework. So nothing new will be brought. So you can replace one library with another, and only the specific of that external implementation will make sense.
Yeah. And one point related on also on the topic that you're covering, that was a really great demo, by the way, Sergei, on the background section background handling, because that's really the key on understanding that. Okay, so when the end user flips the section background, how do I deal with that in my style? So really cool and a simple way of actually doing that. So really cool stuff. And thank you, Andrew, on that.